Since the late 1990s, I've been doing a combination of software development and entrepreneurship, like you talked about, and research in certain spaces.
Mhm.
And I got the opportunity to work with several people like Howard Rheingold and Michelle Bowens of the Peer to Peer Foundation. The work was a combination of research and analysis and programming. And for quite a while, I was involved in helping people design both the application and the use of collaborative online tools, things like that. And I worked with universities like Stanford University or whoever to implement those kinds of things in their learning.
Mhm.
And a lot of that work ended up gravitating toward online learning or augmenting online learning. But I spent a lot of time learning about how people collaborate online and work together. We were trying to read and synthesize all of the knowledge about human collaboration and cooperation from like anthropology and sociology and psychology and game theory, complex system science, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. So I gravitated from supporting people doing collaboration in online spaces to helping people create qualitative and quantitative research, mostly around the food system space, and to do a systems entrepreneur approach with those problem spaces with people in communities. So the thing that I'm doing now as a systems entrepreneur is I'm building up a qualitative and quantitative research business. Most of my clients that I work with are in the space where they're trying to regionalize some part of the food system. Possibly I'm interested in looking at maybe like manufacturing or some other topic areas, but I have a basic. Also, if people are looking for impact analysis on the efforts that they have, I feel I have a pretty good system that's centered around Eleanor Ostrom's IAD framework. That basically it's not as complicated as it sounds. It's a structured way to do inquiry around the work that you're doing and asking people that you're working with, how is this working for you? And then showing them all the dimensions and the people involved, but also bringing in quantitative data when you have that. So if you can see, quantitative data that's important in the questions you're asking, you can bring that in, but then you can also talk with people. And then Eleanor Ostrom had a really good framework that all of her case studies were based around for putting that all together in an ongoing way, month after month, year after year, or whatever cycles you decide to look at. And it turns out that has been a really good way to do impact analysis when people are doing projects and trying to figure out whether, especially not for profits and people that are trying to affect change in
Mhm.
communities, they don't really have a way to do good impact analysis. And really, Eleanor Ostrom's framework is a very good way to do that. We found that there's the social negotiation space where people, in order to collaborate and cooperate, they would need to talk with each other about how we're going to work together extensively, and the amount of work that they would do would be like this small. The amount of work it took to social negotiate would be like this big, and then that's the cycle. We're going to talk about, especially if there was a lot of autonomy and peer-to-peer type freedom with those people, and
Mhm.
you didn't have like someone that could just intervene and make the decisions, then in a more flat landscape of peer-to-peer ishness, you would have to have a lot of social negotiation, unless you created, what people call the stigmergic collaboration spaces, where you actually just create the rules around the collaboration and they're embedded in the system, and then people can come across it and say, "Oh, I see. These is or maybe it even mechanistically is actually determining those rules, those simple rules, and then you have a stigmergic way that you can do this. Components that I would like to build up over time from that is a way to, when possible, create an open data repository of the work that I'm doing.
Mhm.
So I try to convince some of the clients that I work with that, hey, we could just release this data in the open. I'd like to kind of replicate what they're doing with other people and be able to make more and more data open and available as open data. Actually, if as an incubator, if you consider any of the resources, materials, and well, just I'll call them resources that a business or enterprise that you incubate might need, if you consider sourcing those from open source communities instead of either trying to build it from scratch yourself or trying to raise capital and buy it and keep it a private licensed resource, that might be a foundation that people that participate in your incubator could build on, and then they would have a wealth generating pathway that way, where they would be able to replace needing capital and replace needing traditional business outcomes with a commons oriented way of approaching the resources that they need. So just put aside the open data discussion for a minute, and just, there's people right now that are coming to me asking me to source data, analyze it for them, and use it to answer questions that they're asking about their business right now. And they're paying me money to do it right now, today. That's not made up or a dream. I'm doing it. So if I try to piggyback on that action that I'm already involved in and say, well, wait a minute, I could get publicly available data for you instead of buying it from Dun and Bradstreet or whoever. I can try to find source publicly available data for you, and I can apply analysis to it, and then I'll re-release that analysis back out, as long as you don't consider it a trade secret and you don't think that's going to damage your business.
This is exactly what we do with hardware too. You know, somebody pays us to do some hardware and say, hey, we only do open source hardware, and would you mind if we publish it, you know, in some other repositories? And sometimes the deal doesn't go through, and we don't work because we can't work in a closed environment. So we make the thing and we ship it to the sponsor, and they do whatever they want with it. But also we have the people on the other side. So we always engage in a triangular relationship, you know. So we're building value for you. Thank you for your money. Here's your thing. We attended to your needs. We built it exactly as you wanted. But here's another version that is for the public out there, you know. And then that comes back to us, because when people come to us to give us an order, they see, oh my God, these guys have done a lot of things. And oftentimes what happens is that the next guy that comes, we just go back to our designs and just remix them a little bit, you know, shuffle them together, and boom, we can make the new thing, you know, because some of these parts were already designed and integrated in the other things. So that pool of commons that we create doesn't just serve the world, but also serves us, comes back to us, because this is where we feed from, you know, to remix for other things. So the pattern here is triangular relationship. Somebody pays you to do X, and then you feed it to him, and you feed it into a pool of commons that serves the world, but serves you too, and propagates your image further.
Same thing in the data space. So if someone says, well, Sam, you know, when you do this data research, you can't reuse this for anything or any insights. Don't you dare try to help anybody else learn from this data except our company. Then now, if someone else comes along and they're like, you know, and they have like this deja vu of the same question, and you're going to be like, well, I have to like somehow figure out how to make sure that the other people don't think that I recreate, that I just lifted their whole thing, and I have to like somehow recreate that. It's ridiculous that you would have to do this. So I would just try to convince people, like, you don't own the research, you don't own the software, you own the outcome when possible. I will do projects where somebody might want to have the data closed, but I'll at least insist that they allow me to use open source software, which means then I can at least reuse the methods, you know? So if they insist that the data is closed, and sometimes you have to keep the data closed and anonymized, and there's rules and regulations around that. So I'll at least insist that I control the method that I use, and that they don't own the technology. So I'm kind of lemons, and it might take time because you have to build that up over time. But creating a data commons of open data would be valuable from now to 5 years from now for a community of people that's doing collective intelligence systems entrepreneurship. I know it would be, but the value would be zero unless the data was relevant to all the different people who and the problems that they're solving. So that would be a component of it too. It would have to be like you would have to just like sit down with each one and say, how is data relevant to you, and then mapping that into the data that's into that commons, that open data commons. If you can open source like cores of things, you can create a wealth generation around open source technology. So
maybe there's a case to say, that the lab, the notion of the lab, which is like an enclosed area where things happen, it's almost like a silo,
Mhm.
could be replaced with some other type of concept that plugs into different things. So here's Sam creating something that he shares openly around data and data analysis and puts it somewhere. Well, that could be one of these repositories around which you could build your business case, let's say. And Sensorica creates some other form of commons and puts them in some other repositories, and then you could plug there too. And you can plug in many places and do some integration somehow, and the lab just becomes a sort of a space where collective intelligence is applied to all these repositories. So it's not more the lab idea, you have four walls and things happen inside and all the resources are inside. It's like the resources are outside and we're plugging to them because we have these connections also with these people and trust relations that are built. I know Sam, I know Tibi, and I know that what they share, it's pretty good, right? And if I have a problem or a question, I can just go and ask them, so then your resources are outside. I'm just thinking about the architecture of the thing, right? Resources are on the outside, and you're just doing some integration and applying social intelligence to it. You have to come to you to work. He can just stay wherever he is, so you don't bother him, you don't bother me. We're just doing whatever we do and replenish our repositories. But you're just plugging into it, right? And once in a while you need us, once in a while you need us, and then we do you a favor and you do us a favor somehow. That's a model of transaction that we could think about, whatever that might be, whatever shape it might take. But it would also be a nice way to see how we reword these commons creators. So I see it as a sort of a second layer where you add value to the commons. Some people are producing them and dumping them into a repository, and they have their own ways to reuse it, right? To remix that into their own work. But then there is a second value creation layer on top of that, and I think the term social intelligence is pretty. It sits well at that level there, at the second level. It sits well at the level of integration of all these commons, right? Because you need to look at it from different perspectives. You need to have people that apply that try to apply this commons pool to solve like wicked problems, complex problems. Like somebody can come and say, hey, we have a virus, and it has different facets. Here's a bunch of commons. Here's an ocean of pool of commons, right? That I can go and feed from and tackle these things from different angles. You have to swim through that ocean of. You have to map the commons repositories. You have to build relationships among them. You have to understand, what you need and how to get it, and then you go into the social and the politics, because to deal with a community like Sensorica, you need a specific approach to deal with a community. Some other
You
open source.
basically need like social diplomats to go out to the repositories and agreements with the different repositories and
yeah, for most of the time you can just grab and use. Most of the time you can just grab and use, but a lot of times you need integration. You need some modifications, and then you rely on the community.
What kind of integration are you talking about? Does that mean technical, or does that mean social, or both?
Well, if we speak about commons like software and hardware, it's technical integration. I mean, I take a piece from here, a piece from there. They're not made like a puzzle and they fit together like a hand in glove.
Right.
You always need to change them a little bit to work with them, so that part A works well with part B and they fit into another system, right? So that's what I say about integration. Nothing is made to fit plug and play.
Right.
So can I just ask if Christina Bowen had this image, and it just comes to mind. I'm just seeing if this is what you're talking about, and it it was like Legos with these weird little things that made them be able to be attached to Tinker Toys. Then they had these like weird little things that made them play with like some other building supply. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if those
Yeah.
little thingies, whatever made them work together would be the analogy.
That I would say that's integration, or sometimes you could get, because really there's two standards there that
Mhm.
someone already made, the way that the Lego knob works versus the other thing. So
Right.
you could already look up that standard and say, ooh, I can make my part that connects. But if I make something that doesn't have a standard, you could still do integration, but you'll have to study my thing and shape your piece to connect. So you could either have people that integrate, that use, it's easier if I publish a standard for how you can interoperate with my thing, it's going to make it easier for you to integrate than if I just make something and say, you figure out how to integrate with this. And you could do it, but it's going to take a lot more work for you to tune the transmitter to the receiver of the other thing.
Okay.
Big thing that I find myself doing with more traditional entrepreneurs is
Mhm.
helping them understand like what's happening in the world. And so if you had an entrepreneur that was like a young Tibby, and he cared in part, not totally, but in part, he thought like, well, I at least need to know like if there's a market for this, or
Mhm.
like what the conditions are in the ground for, and it doesn't have to be market capitalist, but you might still care what the conditions are on the ground, even if your economic model is different than a capitalist approach. And that's one of the things that I'm doing. And it might be relevant to, as something I could bring to the table with people that you're working with. So if someone says, I want to do thing A, B, and C, and they don't really know how it relates to they can't see the conditions, the environment that they're in. That's one of the things that I can do, is help you see the environment that you're in, both with quantitative data, but also with talking with people and a systematic approach to either surveying or interviewing people. Um, it usually takes some resources to do that, but then we will analyze our talking with people, and we can turn that into an analysis. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about analysis, is I actually apply
Mm.
similar analysis to what the US Census applies to the surveying that I'm doing.
How do we start constructing federated databases from the memetic side to try to figure out our particular area at Kika Lab in collective intelligence is discoverability. So what we're trying to do is trying to see which project over there is actually quite similar to this one over here, even though they're using completely different language to describe themselves. And maybe two projects sound almost exactly the same. They're actually totally different. So to disambiguate those projects which seem the same, and to make increase a discovery on things which may be in different domains or fields, but we're actually with people who have similar spirits or on a similar quest.
Because you're saying we will look at projects and find similarities and see if there's any synergy between them, even if they use some other language. But when you say find, is that in your own database, or it's any project all over the internet? Like, can you find a project in Sensorica, let's say?
Yeah, so I mean, what I'd like to do, if we can start having the technical means of federating these databases, then what I've been developing in this idea of the hashverse is like, the idea is that you would ditch the idea of having a meta schema in a federated database. You will maybe have many different schemas that you can start attaching things to, and then build up the number of connections, so that if A equals B and B equals C, then you can start making inferences that A is kind of equal to C. And
but you have to have a meta schema to do to do that, because you would say like A is, you would have this triple of data. You would say like A is the same as when Sam says B, and that's your data. That's your triple.
I think that you need different meta schemas in the mix that you can attach them to.
You do, and I'm pretty sure I understand what you're talking about. And I've in my mind, I've always called it like a commensurability of ontology. So you have, Tibby has an ontology that he applies to all of the, I could take Tibby's computer and suck all of the files and emails and every chats, Facebook posts, documents, whatever, every bit of data into something and try to create an ontological understanding of it from that. I could also talk with them about it, and they could say, well, look, this is how I categorize all this stuff. That's Tibby's ontology. Then there's an emergent ontology that comes from just the words that are actually used in Tibby's data. But then I could take Lauren's computer and I could suck everything in and do the same exercise with you. And then you would have a commensurability between the ontology that you create and use, the language that you use, the ontology that emerges from it, because that's what's in the language that's in your communications and data. And then there would be the way, the reasoning that you use, the epistemology that you use to map the ontologies and say, well, here's why when Tibby says open hardware, it means the same thing as when Lauren says, I don't know what you would say, probably the same thing, but if let's pretend it was different, then it would be and here's why. It's not just that you said open hardware and some other kind of hardware, but there was something about that comes together, and you have to, and that's a non-machine thing where you have to have people sit down and analyze and decide together that, hey, this actually means that, but you could have a technology that sucks it all in. You could have a mapping that says, this is how you categorize stuff as a person. Then you could have the discussion of how these things relate and apply models. So you could take my enterprise and you could say, okay, Sam, are you trying to just create something and push it out into the world and hope that people are interested in it? Or did you find people that want that now and you're letting them pull from you toward that? Like, what model are you using? Are you using a push model or a pull model? And in my humble opinion, I would put aside the federated data part of it and first even be able to do what we're talking about on data, because federated data is hard. I can tell you right now, I worked for 2 years in the Holo project and several years on other distributed data projects. And I'm here to tell you that you have to, right now, to participate in the federated data system, you probably have to be someone like myself or Tibby that even cares about it, number one, and actually could kind of like hold up your end. You become, like, if you use cryptocurrency, you become a bank. You have to figure out how to securely move the money from cryptocurrency to real money or whatever. It's now on you.
But my thing is, it's always people like you, and if you don't have people like me with my mind, so who has been excluded from these conversations, you need people like me, who also are working in there to actually like plug ideas together. So it's not just because
absolutely, I agree.
Again and again, you have these developers talking about this, and normal people, we don't even know what ontology means.
And you could say, let's totally make this distributed and open in the end, but to take on the challenge of distributed and open and do all the stuff you want to do with data all in one go is going to be really hard. And that's why no one's done it yet, because it's really hard to do. But I would, if you were, and especially right now, if you're just bootstrapping and starting this, I would start with the simplest approach possible to be able to correlate this data and map people's understandings and see what's matching and what's not. And then you can bring that into distributed data technology, but it's pretty simple. And it's like, there's a language, a label that you apply onto something, language, and it unpacks into whatever. When you say it in your mind and you imagine all the stuff that you imagine and the meaning that you apply, that's what it means. So if I say open source hardware, and if you could like see a window zoom into Tibby's mind and see like the movie that plays in his mind, and if he could tell a story about that, that's what it would mean. That's what ontology means. You're applying, but really it's better if you actually think about all the things it means to you when you apply a label to something. And not just the label. Like
when you say that, it does make me think of pattern language and just using little stories instead of just saying the word or defining it, to be, actually videotape people saying little stories about this and That way people can say, oh, that sounds like that. It makes it a lot easier than just a definition, which is like, oh, okay.
That actually could be something that you could analyze, is to say, like, ask people to tell these stories, try to capture what they say, let other people follow up. Like Tibby could come across my story in some directory and be like, I want to talk to this guy. I got questions for this person. And then when he asks questions, he could write down the Q&A, you know, a little bit, or one of us could. And then that just becomes richer and richer data about what it really means, what we both mean. And then someone else could come across that, and they might still have questions, but each person has their own meaning. This is the problem that we're faced with. Each of us interprets these things, and there's overlap in our interpretation, but there's also uniqueness, so that you have to figure out some way to do that unpacking and mapping. And it's the same thing that Eleanor Ostrom did in her IAD framework. She was just asking questions, asking people to tell a story, just like what you said, taking that down, and then trying to figure out what kind of data, what kind of useful information did I get from this that ends up becoming knowledge, that ends up becoming wisdom through iterations on it. You know, maybe you keep asking more and more questions. I give an initial story that you interpret it, and then someone interprets your interpretation and my interpretation, and so on and so on. If you have the ability to keep extending that, and that can become a database that you can try to find the patterns across, but also a human being can read it and understand it too. It's because it tells the story. It's like, that's what I was saying if I say open source hardware, and then there's a story that's playing out in someone's mind, you know, that's what you want, is the story that's playing out in someone's mind. Like if I was this entrepreneur that participated in your incubator, you could apply this method to me, but I should also apply this method in my inquiry to how I interface with the world. So I should also be asking whoever I'm going to deal with, if they're a customer, if they're community people, I should have a framework to easily do the same thing, as like a fractal of how you're incubating me, and then I could actually easily get a richer understanding from other people about how I interface with them. You see what I'm saying? Like I can ask the stories of that, whatever method and toolkit you come up with can be, that each entrepreneur should be empowered to easily just do the same thing. You know, that would be really valuable for somebody who has an idea, they're trying to have it incubated into something in reality, and they can't really see how they fit into the environment very well. And then they're going to try to make decisions based off of that, and project and predict and have foresight, because you could change things just by, people would be like, whoa, like, surprise, you just made this thing I never thought of before. And if you said, you know what, screw research, I'm going to make this thing, I got a really solid vision, just going to push it out there, and people might respond to that. So it's not invalid, but I've only seen a small amount of people succeed with that really have a clear vision and the courage to pull that off. So most people will need to look at the environment, probably. That would be my assumption. Or they need to learn how to become those few people that can succeed like that, and just push something out there and just make everyone conform, you know, kind of like, not conform, but evolve the environment a bit to what they've done. People who have ideas and they're searching for business models, sometimes that could be a big fit right there. Is like, if we actually found the demand for where people have that need right now, and then you can see like, oh, the money could flow to you because you can provide, your idea fits and can do this way, like identity providers and so on. Then if they're interested, that could be a way that they could actually bootstrap their enterprise and you know, there's a lot of that. Or it could be less market driven and more of like, you know, peer-to-peer oriented outcomes, but it doesn't really matter. I think if you look at where people need things now, you have a better chance most of the time. That would open access to a lot of other people with software and hardware, with like the problems that people are going to try to solve in the next 20 years are going to be pretty heavy in the hardware and software space. And if it's all closed and proprietary and commercial and out of reach, then we're going to keep struggling the way that we're struggling now. Only a few people are going to be able to play in the space and solve problems with those mediums, with software and hardware. In a deeper process for continuing to inquire about what people mean and what the crossover could be with somebody else. And if you were driving that, then you could use these quantitative data analysis, but also have your process and figure out how that works with it. Because you can keep going deeper and deeper with people And you could also just be the guide that says, well, hey, you should talk with Tibi, because I know from talking with Tibi that that's one level of connecting people, but then you can use all this other stuff to get even more insight from everybody's stuff, from everyone's data and stories and whatever. That is something that I do have on a fundamental level with the work that I did with Food 21. So I can currently read and pull out some concepts and create text databases, and we can search through it, and that isn't something I just dreamed about. I do have, that's something that I should talk with you more about, Lauren, with the incubator, on applying that to what you're doing. That I wouldn't mind sharing it. It's not much to make it an open source software thing.
Okay.
That we could try to use for the purposes that you're talking about. Blog posts, blah, blah, blah. So I've taken them all and I read them with a computer instead of reading them myself.
Mhm.
And then I have the computer tell me what is very common in terms of concepts, places, people's names, whatever. And then I can still going to read all these things, but I can use that to prioritize what I think is more important for me to read now.
Interesting, yeah.
And then when other people try to work with us, then I can use that and say, like, this is like the map of what's in this stuff, or maybe eventually even I could just give them a 1-paragraph synopsis and say, don't bother reading it. This is the takeaway. Whatever. You don't have to read this whole paper to know that the main takeaway is this. But anyway, that's something we could think about applying to some of the problems you're talking about too, that I've actually spent a lot of time.
Incredible. Honestly, that's what everyone wants.
I think I would have a use for that too. And it's
Okay.
interesting it's good to learn that you have these tools at your fingertip, and that you know how to use them.
It's working for you. That's a pretty big qualification for you. If it actually, like, you can prove to yourself, this works for me now.
Yeah. That's
yeah.
exactly what we're trying to do. The easiest possible testing of the hypothesis and how it works. Without spending massive amounts of effort to.
Yeah. I would keep doing that. And if you have technology people like me and they're like, oh no, you've got to use, this technology or something that doesn't even work yet, like holochain or whatever. And I would say, cool. Yeah. This is our roadmap, and we can put that way down here.
Well, it's sort of like, in holochain and common stack, like, amazing communities of like incredible people, and like everyone's sitting around waiting for the guys to like be done with their like amazing technology. And it's just like, that's
well, one of the clues on those is that somebody put way too much into it. Like a lot of these things could be way simpler, even if in the technological part of it.
Have to start with the human algorithm and see, like, is this actually working with humans? Do they like it? And then you start to automate those processes that people love. And I think that's a great way of building.
That's usually the best way of doing it, unless if you're integrating already existing machine systems, then maybe no. But if you're doing something that you have human beings are going to interface with it, then totally you're better off modeling that and thinking about how it's going to work. And I agree with that. And making a very complex system, you would be better off releasing the simple mechanisms that make the complex system work, and then people can understand and utilize those parts and wrap their mind around it and start doing some of the things that they're supposedly able to do without waiting for the giant, end game system to be in existence before they can even do the simpler part.
No, that's interesting how you say that, because I started building this model for collective intelligence called minimum viable upward spiral. So I started to map out what I think you need to make the simplest complex system that will get smarter over time and not get dumber. So I mean, like theoretically it would be exponential, but it partly starts out, I'm sure, much dumber than just like regular hierarchical system.
It's simple, but complex systems emerge from simple rules. So the complexity that is very, rich and diverse that's in the world emerges from very simple rules. I'm sure that you know this from complex system science. And so what you're talking about is if someone can pull off doing that and growing that way, it can be a much better way than trying to wait until you build a lot of complexity into something. And the other thing is when you make something, this is why I was talking about the environment before, is like, I could make something over here in my little space, but then if I put it out in the world, then the world is going to co-evolve with it. It's not just that my thing is going to be whatever it is, but it's going to create some kind of change in the world, and then I'm going to have to react to that change. Either I got it exactly right for how the outcome would be, or I'll have to be like, oh man, look, this is what happened. I better come back and make an adjustment, which is my co-evolution with my putting the thing in the environment. And if I create an enterprise, a business, a technology, and an effort, and then once I put it in the world, it's co-evolutionary with the environment from now on. We're talking about where you say, all right, what are you doing, and how can we break it down into these simple parts? You put it into the world, see what happens, and then you can do the next level of the spiral of the co-evolution from that. You can see what happens. The closer you can get to doing that, the better you'll be with succeeding in trying to do whatever you're trying to do. If you can figure out how to make that simpler part of it and put it out there. And I could give you some good ideas, but another way to research is to actually to put it out in the world and see what happens, and see how it dynamically co-evolves with everyone that's out in the world that uses it and everything that could happen from that. So, and I would do both. If you could actually let's get a snapshot and information about what happens, but then let's also actually do a real thing that we could then try to also gather data and analytics on and understand, and stories from people, and understand what's happening.
I really feel like if you're not in a culture that by its nature, like woven into the culture is the imperative to make people experiment, they will not naturally do that. Like they will not naturally build things agilely. It almost has to be forced.
Yeah. So some people will, but not with like enterprises, because that's probably our culture. You're probably right. Like Western culture is probably somehow telling them, you don't do it that way. You make a big plan and you wait and wait and wait and wait and wait, and you try to save face and all this stuff that's part of.
You want it to be a success. Well, you don't want people to try and be like, this sucks. Like,
yep. Maybe something that a role that you actually are providing is to help people remove the fears to do those things. And actually, if you tell them that, it's like, hey, this is why some people will try things out in one context, and even if they do really deeply care about it, but they're not afraid to experiment in that context. But when you get into this space, everything's been framed for us through our culture to be afraid. Like, I don't want to lose face. I don't want to, people to say that I suck or whatever. But actually, if you remove that fear and try things out, then you would have a chance to succeed better than if you wait and wait and wait. We used to have a joke around in the area that I work in, when I used to go and work in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and some of the people we worked with there, we would joke around and say, like, there's exactly two ways to do something. There's like one way and many other ways. That was our joke. And just because we would say that joke when someone sounded like they were kind of saying, like, there's only one way you can do this. There's only one way. And our minds focus on that. And different people, it's different contexts depending on what they're trying to do. But a lot of if you find your mind centering on that, it's like, there's just this one way, like you're holding it, like my precious little way of doing this. Nobody can have it. And then that's usually where you can realize, like, all right, that's where what you're talking about. Like, there's all these huge universe of assumptions you're applying.
You can't tell them their project is stupid, because then they crumble, and then they're like, but that's me and my soul, and everything is wrapped up in this project that I've been imagining that I must complete in this way.
Yeah.
Complete nuts, but that's how people are, and like they then cannot separate themselves from like I want to help people do this. Instead, they become like, I need to do it this particular way, and then they can't even see another way of doing it. It must be this way.
And people have to have some of the built-in potential and insight and dissonance to be able to change that, or otherwise that's usually where incubators end up, a role that they play. In my experience, when I've worked with incubators in the past, and Food 21 is incubating businesses, you usually help people understand, like, look, I understand this is the grand scheme that you have. I understand this is the plan that you have now. And you don't even have to tell them it's stupid necessarily, but you can just say, here's here's an opportunity to maybe evolve your plan into something that could work now, and then you can evolve that toward this grand scheme that you have, and keep, hang on to the grand scheme. Don't get rid of it, but keep checking in with it and evolving it over time as you put the short-term plan into action. A component for what you can do right now. Let's find out where people want to buy this right now today. Let's make sure that's part of the analysis that I do for you. And then you can bootstrap your business now, but then grow toward that later.
I really think that matching these people who don't know how to get things into smaller parts, kind of teach them somehow to think like that.
Probably would have to also steward and guide and Sherpa those people too. Like if you just simply matched me with somebody else, I probably would, or they might walk away from it without someone guiding that relationship building. So this is something that, when I've been working in these spaces, like with the Next Edge group and all these iterations over the years of these networks of people talking about doing some variation of what we talk about, the idea of project matching or capabilities matching has always emerged over time, but no one has really figured out the human problem of how to build those, whatever kind of relationship they're imagining would happen from that. It's not enough to just tell me like, hey, Sam, this guy knows something that's related to what you're doing,
Right.
But if I don't know, then it depends on the type of relationship that you try to cultivate. And if you say like, I'm just going to bring you together with them and talk, or actually here's a structured way that you could learn. Are you interested in learning from this person? Yes or no? And if so, here's a way that you could learn, a pathway, and here's what would be in it for you, and maybe what's in it for the other person too. And those kinds of things. No, there's not a lot of people that were doing that part because it's hard to do and it's time consuming, but it also could be systematic, if it was framed right.
This guy named Bodo Honen has a learning path and a doing path where someone says like, this is what I want to accomplish, and then you map that out. This is what you have to do, and this is actually on the separate path. This is what you have to learn in order to complete that.
And then, but then if I was the person offering the learning, then you might have to show me like, this is why it would be useful for you to share your knowledge with people, or whatever it is that would be coming from my end of it. That's awesome though, because that's what's needed, really. That's kind of just like an education context where they don't stop at like, well, we just matched you up with like, this teacher knows this, you figure it out, go. Instead it's like building the bridge all the way to the person and how you would work with them. Right. That's hard to do, but if you unlock that with what you're doing here, I think it'll go way past what a lot of people have been trying to do in these kind of incubating the projects efforts and matching up people in communities and networks.
Systems innovators, it's like each one of us has some weird ass, completely quirky thing that we need to work out, and is different for everyone, and like that's kind of holding us back. And so it's almost like it needs to be personalized. You need like someone doing the intake, someone who's really intuitive, who can be like, I think this part, like you need to really listen in the interview, like
some kind of guide or some kind of whatever you wanted to call them. And they would do this listening, and they would have a systematic way behind the scenes of doing things. But with you, they're just listening to you and figuring out how to map you into whatever programs end up being appropriate based on what that person says. And behind the scenes, you have a coalition of people that are helping you design the resources that come to that person or whatever they're bringing to the table, and integrating that on a higher level, and helping you adapt all of that over time, so that when you map a plan for someone, the plan is appropriate to what's happening in the network and the world,